There are certain conversations where you can tell almost immediately that everyone involved has accidentally wandered into the future without packing a lunch. This was one of those conversations. We were sitting together for a panel discussion with Mike Rowe, founder and CEO of the MicroWorks Foundation and host of The Way I Heard It, Matt Welch, editor-at-large of Reason Magazine and co-host of the Fifth Column podcast, and Sarah, host of the Sarah Palmieri Show and writer of the Red Letter newsletter. And then there was the audience. The audience was already laughing before anyone had solved a single economic problem, which was probably the correct emotional preparation. The first question went to Mike. The subject was artificial intelligence. More specifically, it was Elon Musk's prediction that eventually nobody would need a job because artificial intelligence would make work optional. Now, whenever someone says the phrase work will become optional, there are two possible reactions. One is optimism. The other is the sudden realization that somebody still has to pay the electric bill. Mike hadn't actually heard Musk make the statement himself, but he'd heard the general argument before. AI, according to the increasingly common prediction, could eventually take over huge portions of human labor. That sounded futuristic. It also sounded like the sort of thing that becomes much less exciting when you start asking practical questions. Musk had also been talking about Optimus robots, humanoid machines that, in his vision, could eventually become enormously widespread. The name itself seemed designed to calm people down. Optimus. It sounded less like a machine that might replace you and more like a motivational speaker who wanted you to believe in yourself. There was a joke to be made about the name, and naturally, one was made. If the robots are called Optimus, why worry? Be optimistic. The audience laughed, but underneath the joke was a serious question. What exactly happens when technology advances faster than society can adjust? Nobody really knows. There is no crystal ball. There is no historical precedent that tells us exactly what happens when machines become capable enough to eliminate huge categories of human employment. That doesn't mean it won't happen. It simply means that anyone speaking with absolute certainty about the next 3, 5, or 10 years is probably doing something more complicated than predicting the future. They're guessing. And some jobs are harder to automate than others. The panel discussed jobs such as pipe fitting and other skilled trades, work that at least in the near term remains extremely difficult for AI to replace. Those are the kinds of jobs that can still command six-figure incomes. You can build an incredibly sophisticated computer, but eventually somebody still has to show up with the tools. That's the strange thing about technological predictions. People tend to imagine the future as a giant room full of computers, while forgetting that the physical world remains stubbornly physical. Pipes still leak, machines still break, buildings still need maintenance. And if you've ever tried assembling furniture with instructions that were supposedly simple, you already know humanity isn't quite ready to outsource every practical task to a machine. Still, the speed of AI development makes long-term predictions almost impossible. 3 years ago, certain capabilities seemed ridiculous. Now they're routine. 3 years from now, something else could happen that currently sounds ridiculous. And that's where the conversation became more uncomfortable, because if AI eventually eliminates enormous numbers of jobs, what happens to the people who once performed those jobs? The obvious answer people offer is universal basic income. The government gives everyone money, Sybil. Except it isn't, because government money has to come from somewhere. If fewer people are working, fewer people are paying income taxes. So the question becomes almost comically basic. Who pays for the universal basic income when there aren't enough workers left to pay for it? It's like deciding to open a restaurant where nobody has to pay for dinner, then discovering that restaurants require money. The conversation suddenly moves from technological optimism to arithmetic. And arithmetic has a particularly irritating habit of refusing to care about ideology. Then came another question, one that was much more political. Would Tucker Carlson run for president in 2028? The question itself sounded hypothetical, but there were reasons to ask it. Carlson had released a 10-point plan for America. That is, to put it mildly, candidate-adjacent behavior. You can host a podcast. You can criticize presidents. You can tell people what you think the country should do. But once you release a 10-point plan, you've wandered into the neighborhood where presidential candidates tend to live. And the panel saw another important factor. There was dissatisfaction inside Trump's political coalition. Some MAGA voters were unhappy with the war. Some disliked the tariffs. Some disliked high gas prices. There was frustration over other issues as well. And Tucker Carlson appeared to be positioning himself to Trump's right on several of those questions. That was the interesting part. Trump had built a political identity around promises to disrupt the existing system. But if Trump doesn't deliver everything his most devoted supporters expected, someone else can come along and say, "You promised disruption. I'm actually going to do it." That's a powerful political position. It's also an easy one to occupy when you aren't responsible for governing. That distinction mattered. A podcast host has enormous freedom. A podcast host can say something provocative on Monday and then spend Tuesday explaining what they meant. A president has to deal with budgets, military decisions, international consequences, economic data, congressional pressure, and all the other wonderfully unfun things that come with actually being in charge. The panel joked that podcasting comes with fewer responsibilities, and there was truth in that. You can build a massive audience while avoiding the particular burden of having to turn every opinion into a policy. That doesn't make the opinion meaningless, it just makes the job different. Then came the question of whether Carlson could realistically make a third-party presidential run. And that's where the panel became skeptical. Running for president outside the two major parties is not simply a matter of announcing that you're running. It's an enormous organizational undertaking. There are ballot access requirements. There are fundraising demands. There is infrastructure. There are staff. There are endless details that are invisible to people watching from home. It is much easier to host a podcast. That became the joke, and probably the most realistic conclusion. The panel also discussed potential Republican successors, including J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio, and whether being associated with an unpopular Trump administration could hurt them. The logic was straightforward. If Trump's approval ratings remain in the 40s or lower, anyone standing immediately beside him has to be careful. History doesn't offer a simple formula for vice presidents succeeding their presidents. Sometimes it happens. Sometimes it doesn't. There were examples and counterexamples tossed around, including Al Gore, Joe Biden, George H.W. Bush, and even William Henry Harrison as a humorous historical exception. The point wasn't that history follows a clean rule. It doesn't. The point was that succeeding a president is complicated enough without inheriting all of that president's baggage. And then, just as the political conversation was becoming sufficiently serious, the panel moved to Ariana Grande, because apparently the modern economy, presidential politics, celebrity culture, and AI robots all belong in the same afternoon. The discussion centered on Grande stepping back from the public spotlight. There was an obvious sensitivity to the subject. The panel wasn't trying to diagnose her. The concern was about her appearance and whether the public has a responsibility to notice when a celebrity may not appear healthy. That raised a larger question. When does public concern become intrusive? Celebrities live in a strange environment. People watch them constantly. They comment on their appearance. They discuss their relationships. They speculate about their health. And then sometimes the same public that helped create that pressure decides it has a responsibility to rescue them from it. Britney Spears was mentioned as another example of the complicated relationship between celebrity, fame, public attention, and intervention. There was also a generational observation. The world of entertainment can look glamorous, but glamour doesn't automatically make a person's life good. Sometimes people forget that they see fame and assume happiness. They see money and assume fulfillment. They see a beautiful life from the outside and imagine that the person living it must feel beautiful on the inside. That's not how human beings work. And then, because comedy has no respect for emotional pacing, came a joke about Grande's famous donut incident. Years earlier, she had licked a donut and not eaten it. That became the punchline. How many people can lick a donut and then walk away? The joke was absurd. That was why it worked. But underneath the laughter, the larger point remained. When someone appears to be struggling, the public has to figure out how to care without pretending to know everything. That is a difficult line. And then the panel immediately crossed into another strange modern question. Why is Bank of America reportedly spending roughly $250 million a year on GLP-1 medications for its employees? At this point, the conversation had moved from artificial intelligence to presidential politics to celebrity health to corporate health care, which is basically the modern American experience in 4 consecutive headlines. The panel discussed drugs such as Ozempic in the broader GLP-1 category. There was skepticism about what these medications might mean for people's energy, appetite, motivation, and long-term health. There was also an acknowledgement that nobody knows exactly how the full story will look years from now. That became a recurring theme. We keep adopting technologies and treatments at astonishing speed. Then we act surprised when the long-term consequences aren't immediately available. It's almost as if the future refuses to publish its user manual. Someone mentioned Scott Galloway's view that these drugs could be more important than AI. That claim was met with disagreement. And honestly, that seemed appropriate, because if AI is going to replace our jobs while GLP-1 drugs replace our appetite, we're going to have a lot of unemployed people sitting around feeling surprisingly uninterested in lunch. And then the conversation became darker. War specifically, depletion of America's stockpile of cruise missiles during the war in Iran. Trump had called reports of depletion fake news. But the panel wasn't simply asking whether the report was true. They were asking a more fundamental question. How would anyone know? Access to the Pentagon had reportedly become more restricted under Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth. That makes independent reporting more difficult. If reporters cannot easily access the people and information needed to verify claims, the public has to rely on a narrower stream of information. And that creates uncertainty. The panel also discussed reported changes in casualty numbers, noting that figures had changed on the Pentagon's website. That raised further questions about transparencies. But there was another issue. Even if the missile stockpile was being depleted, should the United States simply manufacture more of the same weapons, or should it rethink the way it fights? That question led directly into one of the most fascinating parts of the conversation, asymmetric warfare. The future of conflict may not be about building bigger and more expensive weapons. It may be about building enormous numbers of smaller, cheaper, highly effective ones. And that's where drones enter the story. The panel discussed how difficult it would be for the United States to outmanufacture China in traditional military hardware. The numbers were staggering. China had reportedly delivered hundreds of ships in a year, while the United States had delivered only a small fraction of that number. The gap was enormous. So the solution might not be to build a bigger factory. It might be to change the definition of what counts as military power. Companies such as Heron, Apex, and Mach were discussed in connection with inexpensive but lethal weapons. The example of a balloon carrying a dangerous payload at high altitude illustrated the problem. If the only way to destroy a cheap target is to spend millions of dollars on an extremely expensive missile, eventually the economics become absurd. You're fighting a budget war as much as a military one, and cheap drones change that equation. They can be produced quickly. They can be deployed in large numbers. They can force an opponent to spend vastly more money defending against them. That is the logic of asymmetric warfare. You don't have to beat your opponent at his game. You make the game too expensive for him to keep playing. Ukraine was mentioned as an example of how rapidly battlefield tactics are changing. Every few months, new drone tactics and countermeasures emerge. The technology keeps evolving. The battlefield becomes a laboratory, and suddenly the future isn't 3 years away. It's already here. The panel even joked about the television series Lioness. If something is happening on Lioness, somebody joked, it must be real. That got a laugh. But the underlying observation was serious. Modern warfare is changing in ways that television writers barely have time to dramatize before reality catches up. And once again, the conversation returned to technology. Only now, instead of asking whether robots will replace workers, we were asking whether inexpensive machines could redefine warfare. Either way, the same question remained. What happens when technology moves faster than institutions? Nobody had a perfect answer. And that was becoming the defining theme of the entire discussion, because the future was arriving. It just wasn't arriving with instructions. After all the talk about artificial intelligence, robots, war, drones, and the future of civilization, the conversation somehow returned to something that sounds much simpler: tariffs. The question was direct. Are tariffs a good way to bring manufacturing jobs back to the United States? Mike Rowe got the question, and judging by his reaction, he immediately realized this was not going to be a relaxing subject. The joke was that he was being asked the question by the people. Apparently, this was what the people wanted to know, and Mike had a reason to be careful. He had recently had Josh Smith of Montana Knife Company on his podcast. Smith had started the company from nothing. Now, the company had 160 employees and was producing knives in the United States. That is exactly the kind of story people like to point to when discussing American manufacturing. One person starts with an idea, the business grows, workers get hired, products are made domestically, a community benefits. It sounds like the perfect manufacturing story, except manufacturing isn't simply about the workers standing on the factory floor. It's also about the machines sitting inside the factory. And that's where tariffs become complicated. Mike described the example of a grinder that Montana Knife Company needed to import from Germany. Because of the tariff situation, bringing in that grinder cost an additional $300,000 for a grinder. That number has a way of changing the emotional temperature of an economic discussion. Because if you're trying to encourage American manufacturing, but the equipment required to manufacture American products becomes dramatically more expensive, you're creating a strange contradiction. The manufacturer has two choices: pass the cost on to customers or absorb the cost. Neither option is particularly attractive. If the company raises prices, customers pay. If the company absorbs the cost, the company makes less money. And if the margins get tight enough, eventually something else gets cut: workers, expansion, equipment, investment. The irony is that a policy intended to encourage manufacturing can create new pressures on the very businesses it's supposed to help. That doesn't mean tariffs are automatically bad. It means the consequences are more complicated than a slogan. And that was one of the strongest points Mike made. Small businesses don't always get enough attention in these debates. The national conversation often focuses on enormous corporations, multinational companies, Wall Street, and government policy. But a business with 160 employees experiences economic policy differently. For a small manufacturer, an unexpected six-figure expense isn't an abstract number. It can change the company's plans. It can affect hiring. It can affect prices. It can affect whether expansion happens at all. And Mike said something else mattered even more: workforce. Finding qualified workers was already a major challenge for many small businesses. Now add higher equipment costs. The pressure compounds. The audience applauded. The response was diplomatic. But beneath the applause was a much bigger question: what exactly does America want its economy to look like? Because that question had been sitting underneath almost everything discussed that day. If AI replaces jobs, what happens? If tariffs bring manufacturing home, what happens? If companies automate, what happens? If workers aren't available, what happens? If businesses cannot afford equipment, what happens? And if people can't afford the products being made, what happens? Every answer seemed to create another question. That is probably why economic discussions are so popular. Everyone likes the first sentence. Nobody likes the 8th paragraph. Then came the final question. And this one was even more difficult. The American economy. The host admitted something many people probably feel but rarely say out loud. I don't understand the American economy. That might be the most honest economic analysis available. Because on one side, the numbers can look incredibly strong. The upper middle class has gained enormous wealth over the past 10 or 20 years, particularly through stock market investment. People who owned assets benefited dramatically. Portfolios grew. Their homes gained value. Their retirement accounts expanded. Their financial lives became more secure. And yet, at the same time, another statistic appeared. A new survey found that 63% of Americans were living paycheck to paycheck. Those two things seem impossible to reconcile. How can wealth rise dramatically for one segment of society while such a huge percentage of people are supposedly struggling from paycheck to paycheck? The contradiction is the story. and the panel tried to untangle it. There are Americans who have substantial assets. There are Americans who have little or none. There are people whose financial security comes from investments. There are people whose entire financial lives depend on their next paycheck. And then there are people who aren't working at all. That introduced another startling statistic. Millions of men were described as being outside the workforce. The question was blunt. What are they living on? The answer isn't necessarily one thing. Some may be supported by their parents. Some may be relying on disability benefits. Some may be living on credit. Some may simply have no paycheck because they aren't participating in the labor force. That distinction matters because someone who has no job and someone who is struggling despite having a job are not experiencing the same economic problem. One person has a paycheck that isn't going far enough. The other doesn't have a paycheck. The panel discussed disability insurance and the growing number of people receiving disability benefits. The Nicholas Evers book was also mentioned as discussing these issues. The broader concern was that the country may be creating incentives that unintentionally encourage people not to work. That is an enormous policy question, but there was an immediate challenge to the 63% figure. Matt Welch urged caution. He argued that paycheck-to-paycheck studies are often produced by activist groups with an interest in emphasizing poverty. That doesn't mean poverty isn't real. It is. But the statistic may not mean exactly what people assume it means. Paycheck to paycheck can be a surprisingly flexible phrase. A person earning a very high salary, but spending nearly all of it could technically describe themselves that way. So could a family struggling to pay for groceries? Those are obviously different circumstances. That is why statistics require context. The number alone doesn't tell the story. And then came one of those moments when the joke writes itself. The panel called Matt Welch the voice of reason because he works for reason. It was a perfect little piece of branding, the kind of joke that almost doesn't need a punchline. Then the conversation moved to market participation. Even if the exact paycheck-to-paycheck figure is questionable, there is a real issue with the number of Americans who don't have meaningful exposure to financial markets. This matters because ownership changes how people experience economic growth. If the stock market rises and you own stocks, you benefit. If the market rises and you don't own anything, you can watch the entire thing happen from the sidelines. That's one reason the expansion of the upper middle class has been so significant. Oxid ownership compounds. Money invested in the market can grow. Retirement accounts can grow. Home equity can grow. People who don't have assets don't participate in that growth in the same way. They live primarily from earned income. And earned income has a limit. You can only work so many hours. You can only receive so many raises. You can only stretch one paycheck so far. That brought the conversation to a proposal involving children and investment accounts. The Trump account idea was mentioned. The basic concept, as discussed, was that families could get children involved in the market in a way that allows them to have some ownership and participation. It isn't a perfect solution. It isn't a cure for poverty. It doesn't magically solve inequality. But the argument was that giving people an entry point into investing could matter over time, especially for families that otherwise might never participate in the financial markets. The idea is simple. If a child grows up with an investment account, they grow up understanding that money can be something they own, not simply something they earn and immediately spend. They can watch it, they can learn from it, they can participate. That may sound small, but over decades, small differences can become enormous. And this was the tragedy at the heart of the discussion. For people living month to month, saving is difficult. It's not necessarily because they don't understand the importance of saving. Sometimes there simply isn't enough left. When the rent is due, the car needs repair, groceries cost more, and the next paycheck is still several days away. Telling someone to invest for retirement can sound almost insulting. You cannot invest money you don't have. And that brings us back to the central contradiction. America is a wealthy country. It has enormous companies. It has sophisticated financial markets. It has advanced technology. It has some of the world's richest people. And yet, millions of ordinary people can still feel financially trapped. That's the strange American economic landscape. A country can be prosperous and insecure at the same time. The stock market can rise while a household's checking account falls. A company can become more valuable while a worker feels poorer. A business can want to hire while struggling to find workers. A government can want to bring manufacturing home while tariffs increase the cost of manufacturing equipment. Technology can promise abundance while threatening employment. Nothing fits neatly into one box. And perhaps that's why every time someone announces a solution, the first instinct should be to ask what happens next. Not because solutions are impossible, because consequences are real. Policy doesn't end when it's announced. A robot doesn't stop being disruptive because somebody calls it Optimus. A tariff doesn't disappear because it has a patriotic purpose. A financial statistic doesn't become accurate because it's repeated on television. And a person doesn't become economically secure simply because the national economy is growing. These were the questions sitting underneath the conversation. But there was still one issue left: the war. And the possibility that America's military stockpile was being depleted. That question returned to the conversation because it represented perhaps the most expensive version of the same problem. What happens when you spend enormous amounts of money using expensive technology to fight inexpensive technology? If the enemy can send a cheap drone and you answer with a multi-million-dollar missile, who is really winning the exchange? That was the challenge of asymmetric warfare. The answer wasn't simply more weapons. It might require different weapons, different strategies, different assumptions. Military establishment has to think about what happens when the economics of conflict change. The same principle applies to manufacturing, and in a different way, it applies to the workforce. Technology changes the economics. The question is whether people change with it. That is much harder because machines can be redesigned. People have mortgages, they have children, they have careers, they have decades invested in one skill. And when technology changes, humans can't simply download the update. That's the part of the AI revolution that gets left out of the futuristic speeches. Everyone talks about what machines will be capable of. Far fewer people talk about what humans will do while the machines are learning. And that uncertainty hung over the final minutes of the conversation. By the end of the discussion, I had started to suspect that the real subject wasn't AI. It wasn't Tucker Carlson. It wasn't Ariana Grande. It wasn't Ozempic. It wasn't tariffs. It wasn't even the war. The real subject was uncertainty. Every question seemed to lead to another question. AI might eliminate jobs. Okay, then what? Universal basic income might support people. Fine, then who pays for it? Tariffs might bring manufacturing jobs home. Okay, then who pays the higher equipment costs? People are investing in the stock market and getting richer. Great. Then why are so many people still living from paycheck to paycheck? Military technology is becoming cheaper. Okay. Then why are we spending so much on expensive weapons? Drones are changing warfare. Fine. Then how quickly can institutions adapt? The pattern was impossible to miss. We are very good at creating new technology. We are much less good at predicting what that technology will do to society. And we are even worse at deciding what to do after the prediction turns out to be wrong. That was especially obvious with AI. The idea that nobody will need a job sounds wonderful if you imagine the final result. You wake up. You don't have to work. You have money. You have health care. You have robots doing the unpleasant tasks. Maybe one of those Optimus robots is making breakfast. Maybe another one is fixing the sink. Maybe a third is reminding you that you should exercise. It sounds great, but the transition is the problem. There is a huge difference between a world where technology creates enough abundance that people genuinely don't need to work, and a world where millions of people lose their jobs before the economic system has figured out what comes next. Those are not the same future. One is a utopia, the other is a crisis. And the distance between them could be enormous. That's why the panel kept returning to the lack of precedent. There is no previous moment in history where humans had to deal with this exact combination of artificial intelligence, robotics, automation, and global economic competition. Previous technological revolutions changed work. The Industrial Revolution did, computers did, the internet did, but AI potentially operates at a different level, because it can affect not only physical labor, but cognitive work. That changes the conversation. For someone whose job involves repetitive physical tasks, automation is familiar. For someone whose job involves writing, analyzing, researching, designing, or processing information, the arrival of increasingly capable AI feels much more personal. And suddenly the question isn't, will technology change my industry? It's, will my industry need me? That's a much more frightening question. But there was another side to the argument. Some jobs are stubborn. The skilled trades were one example. You can automate a factory, but the real world is messy. Every building is different. Every repair is different. Every pipe has a history. Every machine has a problem that wasn't included in the instruction manual. Human beings are still surprisingly good at improvising. And that may be one of the most valuable skills in an automated economy. The ability to walk into a situation that doesn't make sense and figure it out. That's what skilled workers do. That's what plumbers do. That's what pipe fitters do. That's what mechanics do. They deal with reality. Reality has always been AI's most annoying coworker. Then there was the question of politics. Tucker Carlson's possible presidential ambitions represented another form of uncertainty. Could a podcast host actually become president? The answer wasn't impossible, but the path would be extraordinarily difficult. The appeal of third-party politics is easy to understand. When voters are unhappy with both major parties, a third option can sound attractive. But running outside the two major parties is not simply about being popular. You need organization. You need ballot access. You need money. You need people. You need infrastructure. You need to turn listeners into voters. And you need to do all of that while operating in an American political system that is built around two dominant parties. That's a very different job from hosting a podcast. A podcast host can spend an hour discussing what the government should do. A president has to spend the next 4 years discovering why doing it is harder. That's the difference between commentary and governance. And it's why the idea of Tucker Carlson running as a third-party candidate was treated skeptically. The irony was obvious. The easiest place to criticize the government is from outside it. Once you're responsible for it, every easy answer develops several difficult footnotes. That same principle appeared again in the discussion about Trump and his potential successors. J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio could potentially be affected by the administration's performance. If the president's approval rating is weak, association with that president can become a liability. But political history is messy. Vice presidents have succeeded presidents before, others have failed. There is no guarantee. The best political strategy can become the worst one if circumstances change. And circumstances always change. That brought us back to the economy. The upper middle class has benefited enormously from asset ownership. But that success can obscure another reality. People without assets don't experience economic growth in the same way. Imagine two Americans. One owns a portfolio. The other owns nothing beyond the contents of a checking account. If the stock market rises dramatically, the first person's financial life improves. The second person may not notice. This is one reason wealth can increase while economic anxiety remains high. People can live in the same country and experience completely different economies. One person sees opportunity, another sees bills. One person sees retirement savings, another sees the next rent payment. One person sees a booming market, another sees a grocery receipt. Both are looking at the same economy. They just aren't standing in the same place. And that is why the paycheck-to-paycheck statistic caused so much confusion. Maybe the number was overstated. Maybe the methodology was questionable. Maybe paycheck-to-paycheck meant different things to different respondents. But the underlying problem didn't disappear. Financial insecurity exists, so does poverty. The disagreement is about its scale and its measurement. That distinction matters because policy depends on accurate diagnosis. If you misdiagnose the problem, even a well-intentioned solution can make things worse. And there was another group in the discussion that complicated the picture: men who aren't working. The number of men outside the workforce is significant enough to raise questions. If they aren't earning wages, how are they supporting themselves? Some may depend on parents. Some may receive disability benefits. Some may rely on credit. Some may simply have exited the labor market. That creates a completely different economic challenge. Because an economy doesn't only have to create jobs, it also has to make work worthwhile. That's an uncomfortable subject. If someone can survive without working, the decision to work becomes partly economic. The incentive matters. Disability benefits exist for a reason. People can have genuine limitations, so the debate becomes difficult very quickly. How do you support people who truly need help without creating incentives that keep people who could work outside the workforce? There isn't an easy answer, and that was becoming the unofficial theme of the day. There is no easy answer. Even the idea of getting children into financial markets doesn't solve everything. Giving children investment accounts can encourage ownership. It can teach financial literacy. It can create a long-term relationship with saving and investing. But it doesn't solve the immediate problem faced by families who have no money left after paying their bills. You cannot invest what you don't have. You cannot build wealth without some starting point. And you cannot tell someone to think about retirement when they're worried about Friday. That may be the deepest economic divide of all, not rich versus poor, not left versus right. But people who can afford to think about the future versus people who are forced to survive the present. Then the conversation circled back to manufacturing. Mike Rowe's story about Montana Knife Company made the issue tangible. Josh Smith started with nothing. He built a company. He employs 160 people. He makes knives in America. That's exactly what policymakers say they want, but the business still faces workforce challenges. And now the cost of bringing essential equipment from Germany has increased by hundreds of thousands of dollars. That doesn't make the business owner a political symbol. It makes him a person trying to keep a company alive. That is what gets lost when economic debates become ideological. The people inside the numbers disappear. Tariffs are not experienced as the word tariffs. They're experienced as a higher invoice. Inflation isn't experienced as a percentage. It's experienced at the grocery store. Interest rates aren't experienced as a Federal Reserve policy. They're experienced as a monthly payment. AI isn't experienced as technological progress. It's experienced as a coworker wondering whether their job will exist next year. War isn't experienced as a defense budget. It's experienced as a weapon being fired. Everything eventually becomes personal. That was why the discussion about drones was so revealing. Drones are cheap. Missiles are expensive. If warfare becomes dominated by inexpensive autonomous or semi-autonomous systems, then military power starts looking less like the old model of giant platforms and more like an enormous network of relatively cheap machines. The United States cannot necessarily beat China by simply building more traditional equipment. The numbers discussed were dramatic. China had reportedly delivered 982 ships in a year. The United States had delivered 6. Whether you're talking about ships, drones, missiles, or factories, the underlying question is manufacturing capacity. Who can build what? How quickly? At what cost? And how much can be replaced after it is used? That is why asymmetric warfare matters. You don't need to manufacture more than your opponent. You need to manufacture differently. Cheap drones can change the economics. A balloon can force a country to consider whether it's worth using a tremendously expensive missile to destroy it. The cheapest weapon isn't always the best weapon, but the most expensive weapon isn't automatically the best either. The goal is effectiveness, and that may be the direction warfare is moving. The same principle applies to AI. The most sophisticated system isn't necessarily the one that wins. The system that is cheap enough, scalable enough, and useful enough to be deployed everywhere may matter more. That's the uncomfortable lesson of modern technology. Scale beats elegance surprisingly often. Then, almost inevitably, the conversation returned to health. Ariana Grande, GLP-1 drugs, Bank of America, corporate spending, public concern, private life, Agon. The same problem appeared. We want simple explanations, but human beings are complicated. Someone can be famous and unhappy. Someone can be wealthy and unhealthy. Someone can have access to excellent health care and still struggle. A company can spend hundreds of millions of dollars on employee health care and still not know what the long-term effects will be. A drug can be transformative and still raise questions. A celebrity can be the subject of public concern and still deserve privacy. The hardest part of being an adult is realizing that two things can be true at once. Ariana Grande may deserve compassion, and the public may not know what is happening in her private life. GLP-1 medications may help people, and we may still need more long-term understanding. Bank of America may believe the spending makes economic sense, and outsiders may still question it. The answer doesn't have to be one extreme or the other. That is a surprisingly difficult concept in modern public conversation. Then there was the war. Reports about America's missile stockpile. Trump calling them fake news. Questions about Pentagon transparency. Questions about casualty figures. Questions about whether the military is using the right weapons. And beneath all of it was the most basic question of all. How do we know? That's the question that keeps democracy functioning. Not do I like the answer. Not does this confirm what I already believe. But how do we know? If information is restricted, verification becomes harder. If numbers change, confidence drops. If officials disagree with reporters, the public is left trying to figure out whom to trust. And that problem isn't limited to war. It appears everywhere AI companies make predictions. Economists make predictions. Politicians make predictions. Corporate executives make predictions. Everyone is predicting the future. And everyone has incentives, so perhaps the most useful response isn't panic, it's skepticism. Not cynicism, skepticism. There's a difference. Cynicism says nothing is true. Skepticism says prove it. That distinction matters because the world is changing too quickly to accept every confident prediction as fact. Elon Musk says robots could become incredibly widespread. Maybe AI could transform employment, maybe. Tucker Carlson could run for president, maybe. Tariffs could bring manufacturing jobs back, maybe. The stock market could continue creating enormous wealth. Maybe drones could transform warfare, already happening. GLP-1 drugs could transform healthcare, possibly. The American economy could be simultaneously wealthy and financially insecure, absolutely possible. And that's where the discussion ended. Not with a grand theory, not with a perfect answer, not with a prediction that magically solved the future. Instead, it ended with a joke after spending all this time discussing artificial intelligence, jobs, war, tariffs, celebrity culture, corporate healthcare, financial inequality, investment, manufacturing, and the future of the American economy. The final mood was somehow optimistic, or at least artificially optimistic. The Optimus robot was waiting. And honestly, after a conversation like that, maybe that was the most appropriate ending because the entire discussion had revolved around one enormous question: what happens next? Nobody knew, not the politicians, not the economists, not the business owners, not the technology companies, not the military, not the celebrities, not even the people sitting around the table discussing it. And maybe that's okay, because the future has always been uncertain. The difference now is that our uncertainty has better marketing. It comes with robots. It comes with podcasts. It comes with 10-point plans. It comes with surveys claiming that 63% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. It comes with drones. It comes with tariffs. It comes with investment accounts. It comes with increasingly sophisticated machines promising to make human work optional. But behind all those headlines are still people. People who want jobs. People who want to build companies. People who want affordable health care. People who want financial security. People who want to understand whether the economy is actually working for them. People who want to know whether their country is prepared for the next war. People who want to know whether the technology being developed today will make their lives better tomorrow. And perhaps that is the one thing technology cannot answer for us. What kind of future do we actually want? A future where nobody works? A future where everybody owns something? A future where manufacturing returns? A future where machines fight wars? A future where cheap drones replace expensive missiles? A future where celebrities are allowed to live privately? A future where healthcare is more effective? A future where children enter the financial markets early? There are no guarantees. There are only choices, and choices have consequences. That's the part that makes the future so difficult. We don't get to know the ending before we make the decision. We have to make the decision first. Then we live with what happens. And as the conversation wrapped up, There was still no grand economic revelation, no final explanation for how the upper middle class could become dramatically wealthier while millions of people struggled, no perfect solution for workers displaced by automation, no definitive answer about Tucker Carlson's political future. No simple verdict on tariffs, no complete blueprint for asymmetric warfare, no final judgment on the long-term impact of GLP-1 drugs. No universal explanation for how a country can be simultaneously enormously wealthy and deeply anxious about money. Instead, there was laughter, applause, a little uncertainty, and then the show moved on, which, in a way, felt exactly right, because that's how the American economy works. That's how politics works. That's how technology works. That's how history works. We talk, we argue, we predict, we panic, we make jokes, we build something. We discover a problem, we build something else to solve it. Then we discover that the solution created another problem. And somewhere in the background, an Optimus robot is probably standing there, waiting patiently for us to figure out what exactly we're supposed to do with it. Maybe someday nobody will need a job. Maybe someday robots will do almost everything. Maybe someday the economy will become so productive that today's problems seem primitive. But until then, someone still has to make the knives. Someone still has to repair the pipes. Someone still has to build the machines. Someone still has to pay the taxes. Someone still has to verify the numbers. Someone still has to ask, how do we know? And someone apparently still has to sit on television and admit, I don't understand the American economy. Honestly, after everything we had just discussed, that might have been the most reasonable statement of the entire afternoon. Then the music played, the audience applauded, and the future waited outside. Whatever it was planning, at least it had an Optimus. And apparently, I was supposed to be optimistic.